and quite often the people who live in the rainforests, it's in their material interest to stop them being cut down. What's been interesting in Peru is you had the previous Peruvian government of Alan Garcia, who auctioned off 70% of the Amazon rainforest. So again, it's the absurdity that we have a climate policy, and that's not central to it. You're going to sell off 70% of the rainforest. That means that 70% of it is opened up to oil and gas companies so they can go in and explore for gas and oil. We really need the rainforests as one of the things that sustain our planet. You're going to go in and damage the rainforests, and that's to get more fossil fuels. But hey, that's very off the agenda if we're talking about climate change. And the extent to which it is things like REDs, where you fence it off and commodify it, and you're maybe not actually working with the local people. The key organisation that really gives me inspiration is an organisation called ADAZEP, which stands for the Peruvian Intercultural Coalition for the Amazon. And basically what's very, very interesting is that you've got something like 40 or 50 different tribal groups with something like as many languages, who historically may have been kind of quite hostile to each other. What they've done is come together, formed this group called ADAZEP, and whenever there are threats to the Amazon forest, they resist these. So they use non-violent direct action, they use social media, they use the law, they intervene in politics, and on the whole they're very, very effective at preventing the kind of threats to the Amazon. And it's where I do have a criticism of the environmental and the green movement, this is where we need to be starting. I'm very, very rude about David Attenborough, that he's saying we've got a population crisis, and was recently saying that companies have got to give money so that you can buy land for nature reserves. And, if he really cares about the environment, why isn't he saying, hey, there's these people in the Peruvian Amazon, they're really well organised, they're really doing the job, sometimes they get killed for this, how can we support them? So, sometimes I think there's a bit of a danger with environmentalism that people think, shit, it's such a crisis, we're in such danger, let's not waste any time thinking about how we change things. So ADAZEP have been very, very effective. One of the kind of ironies, so 60-70% of the Amazon land was going to be auctioned off by Alan Garcia. So in 2008 and 2009, they used non-violent direct action, so they would block roads and the tourist trail to Machu Picchu, and then work with other indigenous and trade unionists right across Peru. And one of the kind of negative side of this is in 2009 when they did this, on World Environment, June the 5th, something like 100 indigenous people got killed by the Peruvian government. Again, that was something which is very, very lightly reported in the newspapers. So if you look at the newspapers, even The Guardian, you think the main human rights problem in Latin America is Cuba. And, they've got all these people in prison, whereas the main human rights problem is you've got countries like Colombia. Peru has got a little bit better, but certainly Colombia, Honduras, where you've got right-wing death squads and indigenous people and trade unions killed, and there's very little about that on the media. So ironically, it's World Environment Day, and people are being massacred for supporting the environment. But despite that, these people have organised, they've changed a lot of Peruvian politics, they've been involved in elections. And, if I don't do anything else, I'd really kind of flag you up to look at their stuff. Because again, with indigenous, there's a danger of kind of rainbow warrior cliches and in the past and so on and so forth. The impression I get from my little bit of contact with indigenous people is that they want to have their land, and they might respect their culture, and they will respect their culture, but they also sometimes quite want a hospital, and they want to have access to the internet. And probably if I got nothing else out of this today, I would say, if you can read Spanish, and even if you can't, good place to learn, and Google Translate is great. Is A to Z have got a website, and they put up a couple of news stories a week about all the campaigns around the Amazon, and just kind of read that stuff. And every now and again, take stuff and translate it and put it on my website and so on and so forth. But just being aware of that, I think, is really, really important. And in the Peruvian Amazon, like I say, they've done a tremendous job of defending it. I know far, far less about Brazil, but I'm sure you're aware from the media there are big campaigns against dams and destruction of the Amazon, and again that involves indigenous people. One of the places in Latin America where I think Peru is probably where the indigenous are strongest. Also interesting last year that there was a huge battle by the Aymara people in the south of Peru, that you had a Canadian mining company, that wanted to build a silver mine on the sides of Lake Titicaca, which is a sacred lake, and tens of thousands of people protested in the streets and shut down cities, and that was stopped. There's controversy at the moment. There's a new government in Peru who are going to support the indigenous, and in some ways have, and in other ways have portrayed them. But the very fact that the left candidate rather than the kind of right-wing candidate won in Peru in the presidential elections last year was partly due to the kind of agitation of A to Z. So I think in many ways Peru is where the indigenous are strongest. But also in Ecuador, again where you've got the rainforest, you've got massive, very well organised indigenous movements, very, very kind of central to Ecuadorian politics. And again, I've not got time to get into the whole politics of the Latin American left, but if you look at countries like Venezuela and Bolivia and Ecuador, sometimes the governments don't deliver, but they are very, very kind of conscious of indigenous and respect indigenous, and there's a big change in the kind of politics. I mean, sometimes there's conflict, because it's, if you look at Bolivia, you have Morales, who is a indigenous president. By the way, when you do have the climate summits, ALBA, which is the bloc of countries which includes Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador and Cuba, are the people who promote action on climate change the hardest. So when you look at these negotiations, though I'm going to say some slightly critical things about them in some ways, at the international negotiations, they're the people who are really militant. So Morales in his politics is a big deal, but he's called alternative climate summits, talked about how we need Mother Earth rights. In Ecuador, rights for nature in the constitution. You might be aware of the SUNY project, where the government in Ecuador are trying to raise money so that they can afford not to take the oil out. And I was lucky enough to run into the guy who's the planning minister, sort of name dropping last year, and he's very interested in indigenous concepts of good living. There's an indigenous concept called good living, which is the idea of ecological, responsible, sustainable living. Although something that Hugo Blanco said to me is originally there wasn't a word for it, because why would you have an economy that wasn't about responsibility? Anyway, I digress. So, but certainly Ecuador, big movements. I mean, I could just go on in Chile, which again I know less about, but I've got good Chilean comrades. You have the Mapuche, who are people who were never defeated by the Spanish, and they have forests have been taken off of them, and they're in huge conflict with the Chilean government to preserve the forests. And right across Latin America. So a couple of years ago there was a coup in Honduras, and one of the main movements against the coup and the right-wing government is the indigenous. So what you tend to have is quite often indigenous, working with trade unionists, social movements, and they're increasingly kind of shaping the political discourse, certainly in, slightly less so in Brazil, but Ecuador, Venezuela. The indigenous is not particularly big in Venezuela, but it does one of the things that ties in. Although, as I say, there are contradictions, because these countries are still very, very dependent on fossil fuels. So, I'm a great fan of Venezuela. I think great things have happened in Venezuela, but it's an economy which is entirely dependent on oil. And Chavez has talked about how we need kind of socialism or barbarism, or we're going to destroy the earth, but it's still an oil-based economy. And I wouldn't criticise him really, because in Britain we've had an oil-based economy, and we took all the money out of the North Sea. It wasn't being used to fund the NHS and come up with an economy that's sustainable in the future, which is what he's trying to do. Places like you have New Guinea, to go to another part of the world. So half of New Guinea was invaded by the Indonesians in the 70s, and is being mined and resources taken and forests cut down. And there's the Free West Papua movement, and Benny Wenda, who's the leader of this, is exiled in Britain, and again they're in a much more marginal position politically in terms of influence than indigenous movements in Latin America, but they have a very, very important fight to preserve the kind of resources we've got. Okay, so to sort of sum that bit up, what I would say is there's all sorts of reasons why indigenous movements are important, but one reason why they're important, and why they're important for everybody on this planet, is they're actually resisting the forest being taken down and the fossil fuels being taken out, and doing those kind of things that the global framework is not doing. So just in those terms, I think it's absolutely vital to support them. And again, I'm being very, very broad brush, because even in one small area of the Amazon, there's going to be very diverse communities that do very diverse things. And just the fact that, in Peru, there's always been a very strong indigenous movement, but it's been people who've descended from the Incas, who were originally in very violent conflict with people in the Amazon, gives you some of the idea of the contradictions. But to sort of move on to another section, I think indigenous is very, very important in terms of their economics. And you might think this is a kind of very extravagant claim to make, but I don't think there's very much doubt that the kind of basic economic system we have at the moment isn't fit for purpose. And we look at anything from kind of pensions and austerity and so on to kind of see its failings. When you're in an economic system, it seems entirely natural, and it seems like something which is revolutionary to the point of crazy to say there's different ways of running your economy. But as I said earlier, we have this kind of capitalist system. The faster we produce things, consume them, throw them away, the better the economy works. And there was a guy called Lombok who wrote the famous book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, and challenged a lot of what environmentalists would say. I think at heart, really, I'm a kind of skeptical economist. I'm just really not convinced that you can have an economy where there's more and more physical throughput of goods. What we call a kind of extractivist model of the economy, where you take resources from the ground and you cut down forests and you turn them into commodities and you throw them away, and you do this at accelerating rates. I don't think this is really a realistic way of sustaining prosperity. What I'm kind of interested in is alternative models of the economy based on social sharing and commons. You may have heard of the kind of phrase prosperity without growth. And you may have heard of the idea of kind of decoupling economic growth from energy use. What I'm probably interested in is decoupling prosperity and development growth in that sense from material throughput. So it should be perfectly possible to make goods to last a lot longer, to have more libraries for things. If you think of kind of basic technologies that we buy, like computers, laptops, phones and so on, companies design them, if they don't actually have built-in obsolescence where they fall apart, certainly they'll have like the next generation which does the next thing, and the next generation after that, because it sustains their business model. But if you've got to go through 6 different laptops and throw them away and buy new ones, I can't really see that that's in our real solid economic interest.